So let me see if I think I see where you're going. We live in an interesting time, and words are become social conventions. So no matter where the word was coined and what it meant, words begin to take on social usefulness or utility, and there's a social convention around it. In America, we tend to use the word justice around the legal system or the penal system or whatever. And that's the dominant kind of form. And then we have a phrase that's newer called human rights, and we tend to use that around issues of rights violations and great injustices that do an injury to the dignity or the rights held by a certain people group or individuals. There's charity, which is just kind of form of love and giving out of emotion. Compassion leads to charitable giving. So there's different words around this. There's mercy. Mercy really looks at just you could be one way, but you choose to be really merciful with somebody. And these are the family of words that we have. I've chosen justice. I think the Bible, when you look at the words that show up, I think justice is the broadest, most full-orbed word going. I think when you go back and look at where the word justice came from, out of Latin, it really means rendering to each his due in this kind of equity, harmony, fairness in the social structures and dynamics of life, that it's the best word to renew or create social conventions around. So I've kind of camped. That's why we call the Justice Conference the Justice Conference. I feel like it's the best, broadest word to capture not only injustice or human rights violations, but also charity, mercy, and our obligation or responsibility to create a just world. So I feel like it's the biggest umbrella, and it has a lot of shared overlap with those other words. There's a real interesting thing about words. They can tend to be tightly defined or loosely defined. Tight definition would be saying, Ken Wytsma. What's the definition of Ken Wytsma? Me. I'm the only one in the world. So there's a one-to-one correlation between that phrase or that word or that name and me. It's a direct one-to-one correlation. Then there is, in what philosophy we would call a cluster concept, okay, or a cluster definition. What's mean by that is justice, okay? What does it mean? Well, justice isn't a one-to-one. You can't just say mercy and the whole thing is cashed out. The reality is mercy's a part of it. It's a necessary part, but in philosophy it's what's called necessary and sufficient conditions. It's necessary. You got to talk about mercy or love somehow when you're talking about the fullness of justice, but in and of itself it's not sufficient to define justice. So law, ethics, mercy, judgment, morality, I mean, we can keep going. Love, charity, compassion. There's a whole lot of words, and if you think of a flower with a bunch of petals, all those other words have some shared overlap with this concept of justice, and so it's a cluster definition. But that's what makes it, because it's broad and complex like that, that's why it makes it a good word to just plant in the ground and say, we're going to start here and kind of begin to rebuild around this idea of this universal, whereas truth is here, and it brings a right ordering to mental concepts, logical frameworks, etc. We're going to say justice really is the same thing. It's a universal ordering of the social dynamics and the relational dynamics in this world. And again, you see great thinkers that pair the two together synonymously, like William Lloyd Garrison is as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. They both share that same quality of just being there, fixed, period, and we have to somehow adapt to those things. They're not just this one little particular floating around out there. So when we say justice, we're really getting at something overwhelming and huge that governs not only keeping us from perpetrating injustice, but how we handle injustice, how we handle poverty and social justice, how we should think about the legal system. America has 25% of the world's inmates, but only 8% of the world's population. We have the incarceration thing in America is crazy. Well, It's messy. We got to fix it. But it's not just over there. You see, all of us have some sort of a standing in relation to it. We should in some way, shape, or form have empathy for it or opinions on it or desires at least or prayers that it would be more just. And then ultimately, I think when we get overwhelmed by justice, it begins to surface our inability to really be just. And I think that's where the gospel comes in and says, here's the good news. You are incapable of being fully just to the degree that you ought to be. But as you're laboring for that, the grace supplied to you makes you just. Grace makes us just. It allows us to stand as if we were just, even though we're not. Now, the big divide, as you were saying, between righteousness and justice or morality and justice that's grown up is because we're treating these things as small little things that we're dissecting. When you realize how big they are and that they're what I would call theological necessities, they're universals, you realize that justice flows from the character of God. And so love of God implies and requires and necessitates love of neighbor. That you can't treat these two things as separate like we tend to do. Well, I love God really well and I kind of do. They're on one continuum, and love of God implies love of neighbor. And so we can't say I love God like the Pharisee, pray in the synagogues, wear the gowns, and parade ourselves as these righteous people when we have no regard for the weak and the needy, you see. And that's why in James it says true religion isn't the external orientation to God and looking as if you're pure. It's an actual heart change that understands God's view of things and leads to caring about the poor, the weak, the needy, and taking ourselves out of it. And this is where Jesus went, frankly, with, I think you're talking about this idea of whatever you do unto the least of these, you do unto me. And Jesus is saying, if you really understood that this is my sphere of concern, these people belong to me and I care about them, that makes them my sphere of concern. When something's in my sphere of concern, say my car, if you break a window on it, you break my car's window and you offend me. If you see something of mine, one of my children, in need and you do nothing. I've used an example before. If one of them is kidnapped and in sex slavery somewhere, whatever you do for my child to rescue my child, you do for me. There is no distinction there because of my shared sphere of concern with my kids. So Jesus is saying, listen, if you understand how I see the world, then you can't draw a distinction between loving me and loving others, because by loving others, you are also loving me because they're my kids. And that poverty, or that this person's a foreigner in a strange land and nobody cares about them, they don't even speak the language, nobody's there to support them. Their cell phone, if they have one, doesn't have any names of power or influence in it. When we have a crisis, what do? We go to our Rolodex, because there are people on our phones that have capacity to help us. And here's this foreigner with no recourse for aid. And God says, they're not a foreigner to me. They're not a foreigner to me. You need to be their recourse. You need to be their help. And as you do to them, you do it to me, because there's a shared area of concern. So we have to you're right, we have to get rid of these distinctions and recognize that this fabric doesn't just piece into little separate topics that are fun to talk about or study, but there's this fabric of justice that goes throughout, and we somehow therefore have an obligation with regard to it that is continuous with our relationship with God. And so, yeah, I think great question and really important for us to wrestle with and begin to understand. So we can take a follow-up on that or go in a new direction. Yeah.